Okay, thank you very much. We have just under about 12 minutes to open up for some discussion. Obviously, a very wide-ranging set of ideas, ranging from science to capitalism to industrialism to religion. I guess opening up perhaps amongst the panelists, if anyone's interested in responding to anything, and if not, to the public. Yeah. It's a. Lefebvre-Bookchin.
Yeah, there are there are both similarities and differences. I think that, it depends what stage of Lefebvre's work you're looking at. When he's looking at the production of space and urbanization, I think there are certain correlations which exist. I think their understanding of the dialectic is rather similar in its basics, but I think that Lefebvre was much more concerned, I think, with how should we put it, the state and the production of space rather than capital and the production of space, whereas I think Murray Bookchin was much more concerned with capital and the production of space. So there are some significant differences along those lines.
More questions from the audience? Yes.
How does this work? Working? Yeah. First, I have an observation. As we all know, it's Easter, and you've put David Harvey in the middle as Jesus at the Last Supper. I think it's very unfair to the rest of the panel. Second, I wanted to ask if we want to start creating alternatives, then why do we do it in such a asymmetrical way as a conference? And this is, on the whole, why do we put ourselves into capitalist structures when we're trying to create alternatives? And lastly, when we finally do create alternative, autonomous spaces, how do we make it for people, all types of people, capitalists included, so that they want to come and share these spaces with us and start a conversation? Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the presentations. Vielen Dank für alle Vorträge. Und vor allen Dingen war ich sehr inspiriert von dem Vortrag von Frau Sousa aus Indien. Und weil es einfach nochmal eine ganz andere Perspektiven vermittelt, die wir oft eben nicht zu hören bekommen. Also zum Beispiel dieser Gedanke, dass die Teilung Indiens eine erste Form der humanitären Intervention war. Also war einer dieser Gedanken, die ich wirklich sehr erhellend fand, so nochmal zu denken. Und meine Frage wäre, das war ein Gedanke, der ganz am Ende vom Vortrag kam, dass es auch Formen von unten organisierter Bildung, populärer, anderen Bildungsformen gibt. Und Sie konnten da nicht mehr drauf eingehen. Ich würde mir wünschen, dass Sie da noch ein paar Sätze zu sagen.
Okay, Thank you very much for that question and for your appreciative words. I didn't have time to actually build up everything, so thank you for giving me that additional time. I think one of the things about partition of India is that I think the point I wanted to make in that was that there was, you can't impose democracy through an imperial power, which is what we are seeing everywhere now. And when that happens, then you have the Hindu-Muslim conflict, the Shia-Sunni conflict, the something Coptic-Sunni conflicts, all those kind of things are the product of what happens when democracy becomes an imperialist imposition. And that first lesson we learned in that inaugural moment in 1946 when partition of India happened. So that was my main point, which I didn't get to finish in that one. And much of that responsible government policy, as the British used to call it, is very much like the democracy promotion policies that we are seeing today throughout the Middle East. So that was the thing. And the other thing that about the movements, we've had this movement called People's Science Movement in India for a very long time. And one of the challenges for the People's Science Movement is to see whether we can develop, I think what colonial science did was to completely rubbish all the local knowledge of nature and people and societies, and then impose this new kind of knowledge which was considered as the only knowledge. So People's Science Movement actually challenges that. I'll give you a very simple and a small example of one of the things that we have tried to do. When there was a movement on anti-dam movement, opposing large dams, many of the criticism against the movement was that you people are talking about we don't want this dam because of displacement, but you all live in Bombay and Delhi and Calcutta. You have your tap water flowing from the tap. You have electricity. Why should not a peasant or a farmer in the rural areas have the same facilities? So we took this problem to our engineering students who were very active in the students' movement at that time and said, can you help us answer this question? And one of the things that came, I'll cut a long story short here, one of the things that came out of that was we looking at the traditional water systems, where, as you know, India is a very arid, semi-tropical country where we have rain 3 months of the year, and we keep that water for 12 months of the year. And on that basis, we built a very prosperous civilization. That is why the East India Company came to India to trade in textiles and spices and all those things. So there was a productive base, and which the colonial science completely destroyed. So we went back to some of that and said, can we regenerate some of these traditional, what we call the tank systems, which are local, very local systems of conserving water, providing for irrigation and so on. And the engineering students said, yes, of course, it's very simple. We regenerate those tanks and fit a small motor which will then produce electricity that is enough for that village. So you have that system where that village has electricity, the village has irrigation, the village has drinking water, and the village becomes a self-sufficient community. Now the problem for that came not because there was no alternate conception of technology, but because the federal government said that electricity is a federal subject and you can't produce electricity in the village. So you can have an example of how the technology and the law work together. However, the same federal government, when the electricity sector was reopened for neoliberal changes, they were very happy to change the federal laws and privatize all electricity production. So you can see that, how the law and the technology thing works. And there are several other examples like that which one can show. But the basic point of People's Science Movement is to show that that technological development has to come from the nature of that place, because all climates are different, all ecologies are different. You know, a desert is different from a semi-arid country, is different from England, which has rain all around the year. And so it has to come from those places. It can't be something that has come. So that's why we say that the questions for science must change. One of the things that I missed out in this, cutting my paper short, was that much of the questions for science today is presented by militarism. If we look at all our technological innovations since the world wars, they have come from military innovations, including our exercise machines. They were not invented because we should keep fit. They were invented because of the military, the soldiers to train, and then they made commercially available. So, you know, and it's challenging those kind of basic drivers. Even our mobile phones that Professor Harvey referred to did not come because we should all be friends and talk to each other. It came because of military science, basically. So that was, I'll just stop there because I'm sure there are other questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you to every speakers. I have a question or a comment to the talk of second speaker, Comrade Ayaz. In his defense of theoretical basis of democratic confederalism, made criticism against Marxian theory, Marx and Engels. My point goes in this direction. I think we should welcome every attempt to go beyond the existing theory, emancipatory theory. But it might be, or it must be very, very clear how we read the previous traditions, theoretical traditions of emancipatory movements. I think here there was, as far as I see, clear mistakes in reading Marx theory. Comrade Ayaz had told that there were problems with Marx and Engels' idea to analyze capitalism just as a sphere of economy, and he instead mentioned that capitalism is a hegemonic power. Capitalism, is not just economy. That's true. But not in this sense. There are a lot of attempts to explain other spheres, other mechanisms in their society, like gender conflicts, environmental issues, and so on, religion, and a lot of things, state power, and so on. But I think it's a matter of methodology to see how all these mechanisms together. What Marx did actually in his theory was not explaining whole capitalism. I think he was not so, okay, I formulated another way. Marx was distinguishing between capital, the logic of capital, and capitalism. When we talk about capitalism, that's a totality. That's just a theoretical concept that explains all forces and mechanisms working together, interacting against each other in their society. It has nothing to do with the logic of capital. Of course, when we talk about logic of capital, we should see that that this mechanism, as one of the mechanisms, has more or less hegemonic power. It doesn't mean that the other mechanisms like gender conflicts, environmental, and so have no power. Of course, they have their own power. The value of the exchange value to win against exchange value, it is not so easy. There is a lot of resistance, but we should see that the value form is the dominant aspect of the society. In this sense, I would say, while criticizing the orthodoxy tradition of Marxism and trying to avoid it, I think in this respect, again, the same mistake is repeated to read Marxian theory as a theory of economics. I think it's not that there are a lot of different readings of Marx who try to understand Marx's basic books or ideas as explaining the logic of capital, not the capitalism. And for example, the Japanese school of Uno and other people, I think it's a matter of reading of Marx. It would be another form of reductionism to see Marxian idea as just talking about economy. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any response to that? Yes.
Marksizme ilişkin yorumda, şimdi Marksizm geliştirmiş olduğu ideal bakımından kapitalizme ilişkin çok ciddi eleştiriler var, yani alternatif olarak da sunuyor. Fakat kapitalizmi tam çözememesi, yani kapitalizmi sadece emek ve sermaye çelişkisine dönüştürerek sanki bu proletaryanın ekonomik alanda yaşanan eşitsizliğin giderilmesiyle birlikte emek sorunun çözülebileceğini belirtmiştir. Bu noktada hem devlet ve hem iktidar perspektifinden yola çıkarak kapitalizmin de eğer kapitalizmin de bir devleti varsa bizim de bir devletimiz olabilir. Kapitalizm eğer iktidar olabiliyorsa biz de iktidar olabiliriz tezine hareketle. Bu noktada bir benzeşme vardır. Yani belki kapitalizm Marx ömrünün son yıllarında Doğu'ya, Orta Doğu kültürüne yönelmiştir. Yani komünal ekonomiye yönelmiştir. Fakat Kapital kitabında, düşüncesini Kapital kitabında ifade ettiği daha çok Alman Hegel felsefesi, işte Fransız ütopik sosyalizm ile İngiliz ekonomi politiğidir. Bu da kapitalizmi meşrulaştırmıştır. Yani kapitalizmi meşrulaştırmıştır. Dolayısıyla burada alternatif bir model sunma, kapitalizmi aşma, kapitalizmle mücadeleyi alternatif model üzerinde şey yapar o değil. Daha çok kapitalizmin kullanmış olduğu araçlara karşı aynı araç ve yöntemlerle mücadele etmiştir. Evet, tabii yani aynı kapitalizmle birebir değil. Ona Marx'a haksızlık etmiş oluruz. Fakat kapitalizmi aşılmaması ve yaşanan 150 yıllık sosyalizm pratiğinin bir alternatif model olarak olmaması, toplum biliminin yeterince geliştirilmemesi, iktidar ve devlet konusunda kapitalizmle aynı hataya düşmesinden kaynaklı sosyalizmin, reel sosyalizm daha doğrusu, kapitalizm üzerinde çok ciddi bir alternatif olamamıştır. Daha çok hem Rusya pratiğinde hem Çin pratiğinde daha çok kapitalizmi besleyen, kapitalizmi tamamlayan bir şeye ulaşmıştır. Fakat bu noktada Marksizmin geliştirmiş olduğu düşünceler olmasaydı belki bugün Önder Apo'nun geliştirdiği model olmayabilirdi. Yani dolayısıyla Marksizm tecrübe ve birikim ve ideal anlamıyla Önder Öcalan'a büyük bir ilham kaynağı olmuştur. Şu anda Önder Öcalan'ın yapmış olduğu Marx'ın eksik bıraktığı, yetersiz bıraktığı noktaları tamamlamak, Marksizmi gerçek özüyle buluşturmaktır. Yani Marksizm belki yaşamış olsaydı kapitale ilişkin düşünceleri farklı olabilir. Çünkü ömrünün son yıllarında siz de belirttiğiniz gibi toplum bilimine ve uygarlık öncesi tarihe yönelmiştir. Fakat Marx'tan sonra adlarından beklenen mesela Lenin pratiğinde bu olmalıydı. Fakat Lenin'de daha çok devlet, devrim ve devlet konularında yoğunlaşmıştır. Bu da özünde iktidar ve devleti reddetmemiştir. Dolayısıyla belki alternatif model de tartışılabilir. Devleti ve iktidarı reddeden, toplumsal örgütlenmeyi esas alan, toplumsal paylaşımı esas alan, hiyerarşinin olmadığı, halkların, kültürlerin, dillerin, dinlerin, bütün inançların kendisini ortak bir şekilde demokratik konfederalizm biçiminde irade edebileceği bir sistem öneriliyor. Dolayısıyla sosyalizmi devlet ve iktidardan arındırmış oluyor Sayın Öcalan. Bu noktada elbette Marksizmin insanlığa sunmuş olduğu katkılar var. Fakat kapitalizm konusunda, kapitalizmin bugün zirve yapması konusunda da kapitalizmi besleyen yanları da olmuştur.
I think the question that was raised here is quite an important one, and that's why I want to make this small intervention. And I quite enjoyed the response to that as well, so thank you for that. And but what I want to really throw open for discussion is that in our criticism of capitalism, we keep talking about capitalism, yeah? But we don't speak about colonialism, which is an intrinsic part of capitalism. We speak of class and class struggle. So class struggle is the internal dimension of capitalism, and that is what Marx was responding to in his critique of capitalism and revolution in Europe and whatever, which it did have a profound influence on. Whereas colonialism is the external dimension, it's the expansionist dimension, and capitalism has never existed without colonialism and can never exist without colonialism in whatever new form or shape or dynamic that comes from. So I would say colonialism is one of the categories that we need to take much, much more seriously instead of just subsuming it in this big capitalism critique. So that's my first point. The second response to this is that we have a tendency to throw the baby with the bathwater. Because the bathwater is dirty, throw everything out. I think we have done some good things in the past. Yeah, the socialist history, operational, they provided a real challenge to capitalism, and things went wrong. National liberation struggles, do we value it? Yeah, yes, we do, because it's such an important part of who we are today. Not everything went wrong right after independence. So instead of throwing everything out, the question is, can we just take what was good in those things and then say what we did wrong and start that as the starting point? And that is why for me law and science are such an important issue, because to me that was where we failed, in believing that this technology and this science and this modern law was going to deliver us the freedom. I think the fighting we did pretty well. Those national liberation struggles shook the basis of capitalism. That was not bad at all. What went wrong was the way in which we conceptualized the knowledge and the alternatives, and it's the socialist construction that went wrong, not the revolution. And I think that's the distinction that we should really make today. And I just want to conclude by saying that Marx was not a prophet. He was answering questions of his times. And we can't just say, and I think the reason I say this is we also have a job to do. So we can't just keep going back. We have a job to do. That's our responsibility in this time and this age. And how do we develop that in the light of our experiences, in the light of what we did well and what we did wrong. So I just want to stop there.
Over there, yes. Someone. Okay, and then you. So it's someone here, and then over there after that. So.
Den zweiten. Is that I can shout? No. Oh, no, because there needs to be translation. Sorry about that. My question is for the whole panel, but maybe sort of specifically to those who are invoking the idea of the nation. And my question is, what do we mean by the nation, and sort of this idea of making a distinction between the nation state and the nation? Because if you look historically, like at the work of Benedict Anderson, we've been able to trace how the idea of the nation is invoked to justify the state. and to sort of create cultural underpinnings to support state power and to consolidate state power. At the same time, you see nationalism invoked to support minority liberation struggles and to sort of contest power. So, you know, just in sort of the discourse around democratic confederalism, I've seen the nation invoked in a couple of different ways, and I was wondering how we can sort of unpack this idea and maybe critique it or get a grasp on how it's useful, and then maybe what its limitations are as well.
Ja, ich möchte noch mal zwei Fragen beantworten. Eine, die gerade gestellt wurde, und eine, die noch länger zurückliegt über die Formen. Vielen Dank für diese gute Frage oder Anmerkung. Historisch gesehen, und ich glaube, da divergieren wir hier auch auf dem Podium in der Analyse, die spezielle Funktionsweise von Staaten und ihrer Rechtfertigungsmaschinerien fallen für mich historisch zusammen mit den, und zwar im Prinzip schon in der Aufklärung. Natürlich gibt es einzelne Stränge, die wir schon im Mittelalter uns angucken können. Da fallen Nationalismus, da fallen bestimmte Rechtfertigungsmaschinerien in Bezug auf Rassismus, finden da bereits statt, in Bezug auf Geschlechterordnung und in Bezug auf Religion und Rechtfertigung von Gesellschaften. Und in dem Ganzen wabert auch noch Wissenschaften oder die Verwissenschaftlichung oder die Institution Universität in einer bestimmten Art und Weise mit. Ich glaube, dass das historisch alles in der Aufklärung begründet ist. Wie gesagt, man findet immer auch Stränge weiter rückführend. Und deswegen ist, glaube ich, zu unterscheiden, wenn man von Nationalismen heute spricht, als wenn man von Nationalismus oder Nation im historischen Sinne spricht. Geschichte schreiben, Geschichte erzählen ist immer nur, also für mich zumindest, ein Instrument, bestimmte Analysen betreiben zu können. Also die Historisierung von bestimmten Verhältnissen haben aber nicht die gleiche Bedeutung wie soziale Praxen heutzutage. Auch nochmal eingehend, weil David Harvey da auch nochmal eine kleine Nebenbemerkung gemacht hat, dass, obwohl er das alles gut fand, was ich gesagt habe, glaubt, dass sich dadurch Kapitalismus nicht abschaffen lässt oder Geld nicht abschaffen lässt. Ich habe ja von Ideen gesprochen, von Denkschemata, von Epistemologien, die vor diesen Kategorien, also um Denkstrukturen. Es geht mir darum, eine Möglichkeit, Wissen zu produzieren, die anders ist, die neu ist und nicht in diesen binären Denkmustern verfallen ist. Ich weiß nicht, ob Kapitalismus auch ohne Geschlechterordnung funktionieren könnte oder eine asymmetrische Geschlechterordnung ohne Kapitalismus funktionieren könnte. Ich finde diese Diskussion auch müßig. So wie wir es heute kennen, funktioniert es zusammen und nicht ohne. Selbst Gesellschaften, die ohne Geld funktionieren, heute, aber auch historisch gesehen, noch nach der Aufklärung, haben asymmetrische Geschlechterverhältnisse. Was machen wir damit? Das hilft uns heute aber nicht weiter, um neue Ideen zu entwickeln. Und deswegen versuche ich vorher anzusetzen, was sind die Grundvoraussetzungen, wie denken wir überhaupt, wie kommen wir überhaupt zu Kategorien und damit dann auch zu Gesellschaftsanalysen. Und ich glaube, dass diese Form Frontalunterricht, diese Räume in dieser Universität dafür überhaupt nicht geeignet sind. Ich glaube, dass wir anders zueinander treten müssen, wesentlich hierarchiefreier. Hier gibt es eine Hierarchie, wir sitzen hier vorne, wir sind die, die es wissen, und dann gibt es das Publikum. Es gibt wenig Interventionsmöglichkeiten, und wenn wir eine gesellschaftliche Intervention gemeinsam versuchen wollen, dann müssen wir das auch mit anderen Mitteln tun.
I'd just like to address the nation question. I prefer to decompose this into what happens when people develop a certain affection, loyalty, concern for a particular place. What happens when they build a place according to their own wants, needs and desires, and what happens when they try to defend that place. This happens a lot, and it has both positive connotations because there is a creative element in this, in which a difference is often created culturally in terms of modes of being and living together and how. It can also become very conservative in the sense that the defense is about keeping other people out. It says, not in my backyard. It says, keep away, I want to defend my privilege. This is what I think is one of the foundational features of any human society. And people work often very hard to make places the way they want them to be. And I think that's great and has all of these consequences. I think nationalism is one form of that in which, and I don't like Benedict Anderson's formation of it, but it's certainly a way in which people imagine that we, call yourself the Kurds, the English, or whoever, have made this place what it is. And since we have made this place what it is, we have established a right to be here and to make privileged decisions about what shall happen in this place. And I think that issue is actually lurking behind how a confederation of such places would actually work across the fact that different places have been made in different ways, and how can there be coordination and agreement across a confederation? Not impossible, but as we see in existing circumstances, sometimes rather difficult to do. So I think there are some issues, if you like, within the Bookchin model which need to be addressed. And it's about the production of place and the production of space and how that occurs. And I think that this is foundational for the way in which some of us try to think about the specific geographical configuration that capital takes. And just going back for a moment to Marx, one of the things I tried to do was to bring Marx into geography. Turned out that wasn't too hard to do. I've also tried to take geography into Marxism, and it's been damn difficult. They still won't listen. And this is, I think, one of the points that has been made about colonialism and the significance of colonialism. Again, I would want to subsume that under the very general question of the spatial dynamics of capital accumulation, what that is necessarily about, how it is about the replication of class relations over space. What was it that the occupying power in Iraq tried to do It tried to actually impose a market structure and a neoliberal structure upon Iraq, and they called it bringing freedom to Iraq. And it's interesting, again, the concept of freedom that's employed here. And I'd like also to say something that's one of the important contradictions of capital to me, that there's no such thing as freedom without domination. And you have to be clear what it is you have to dominate in order to realize certain freedoms. Right now we need to dominate the central banks. We need to dominate Merkel, Erdogan, and the whole damn lot of them in order to earn the kind of freedom that we truly believe in. But don't imagine that there is something out there innocently called freedom that does not involve domination. And I think it's that dialectic between freedom and domination which is connected to also to what happens in places, what happens in states, what happens to that aspect of the world we call nation. None of this can be treated as something that's innocent, something that is somehow or other pristine. It's always a messy and sometimes very dirty business.
Yes, over here, there's a... Here it comes.
Ich glaube, es passt einfach wirklich nochmal, weil ich kurze Bemerkung machen wollte, auch zum Verhältnis von Kapitalismus und anderen Herrschaftsverhältnissen. Wie auch gesagt wurde, hat es natürlich nicht kapitalistische Gesellschaften gegeben mit Sexismen, mit Kastensystemen oder was auch immer. Aber so, was Radha de Souza so stark macht, dass es den Kapitalismus nicht ohne Kolonialismus geben kann. Das heißt eben Kolonialismus zu anderen Gesellschaften, aber auch innerhalb der eigenen Gesellschaften. Das macht es keinen Zufall, das was Muriel Gonzáles Athenas dargestellt hat, dass mit dem Aufkommen des modernen Kapitalismus in der zweiten Hälfte des 18. Jahrhunderts erst unser heutiges Verständnis von Zweigeschlechtlichkeit als Gegensätze der moderne Begriff von Rassen erst da konstruiert worden ist, weil dann nämlich begründet werden konnte, warum statt Freiheit und Gleichheit Menschen die niedrigeren, dreckigen etc. Arbeiten zu machen hatten. Und diese Privilegien, das ist der Aspekt, den David Harvey gerade stark gemacht hat, wird immer in den alltäglichen Praktiken von denjenigen, die die Privilegien haben, verteidigt. Und deshalb macht es auch keinen Sinn zu sagen, wir müssen erst den Kapitalismus abschaffen, bevor wir Sexismen, Rassismen, Nationalismen etc. bekämpfen, weil es in unseren eigenen Verhaltensweisen mitgetragen wird und es nicht einfach der Kapitalismus ist. Aber der Kapitalismus gibt einfach strukturell vor, dass es immer wieder diese hegemonialen und hegemonisierten Identitäten geben wird und wir werden sie wahrscheinlich nicht überwinden, ohne den Kapitalismus zu überwinden.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because for me it is a question of again, where I come from a third world country, it's a question of what comes first. And to me, it is the other challenges that is going to end capitalism. It's a direction. So when colonialism and the anti-colonial movements are successful, or the anti-imperialist movements are successful, when the gender revolutions are successful, when the environmental movements are successful, there will not be a capitalism. So it's for me, starting from where we are, and taking it towards that instead of imagining capitalism to be this big thing and then trying to. So it's in the process of those struggles that the conditions for capitalism are destroyed. Because and that's why I said, there's no question of capitalism without colonialism. Similarly, there's no question of capitalism without gender and gender oppression. But I just thought I will just comment a little bit also, if I may, on this question of democratic confederalism, which was linked to this question but also came up in the earlier one. As someone coming from South Asia, I have to say that concept is, first of all, I'm very comfortable with it. It's the home concept for me, partly because if you look at pre-colonial South Asian societies, and even Marx's own writings on what he calls Asiatic societies were what sociologists have described as village republics. They were autonomous, economically self-sufficient, politically self-sufficient village economies. And therefore Marx says that these were not really advanced because they did not have a centralized state. Now, we have never been comfortable with a centralized state because for us the centralized state was a colonial imposition. Because we came from being village economies and village republics, which even today has a profound influence on the way South Asians think about the world, to being this. So for us, if somebody says democratic confederalism, we are very happy because it's like going back to our natural state of being, what we were before colonialism. I also want to just mention, and I've spoken to some of my Kurdish friends about this, 100 years ago, we had a very powerful anti-colonial movement that we call the Gadar movement. Gadar in our language means revolt. And the Gadar movement's conceptualization of what they call Azad Hindustan, a free India. What should a free India look like? And they said a free India should be a confederation of nationalities 100 years ago. So, if that was the thing, and of course they were brutally finished, brutally in the sense the biggest bloodbath, and it started the beginning of the end of the British Empire was by the Gadar movement. But I find it very surprising that we never talk about this history, which is there in the colonial history. And so, for me, I'm thinking this is all, very natural terrain. So I just thought I'll throw that up, and last few years we have been celebrating 100 years of Gadar movement. So, perhaps we should have another celebration on Gadar movement and democratic confederalism.
I'm sorry to sound a dissident voice in this. I think it's very important that we look at the actual spatial movement of capital and geographical movement of capital. It's very easy to use a category like imperialism as one part of the world exploiting the other, but if you look more closely, you'll see all kinds of intricate movements of capital. The main exploiters of copper in Zambia are Chinese and Indian companies. Some of the worst examples of what might be called colonialist industrial practices are actually Korean and Taiwanese subcontractors in China, Southeast Asia, Central America, and the like. In other words, the spatial movement of capital has been hopping around from one part to the other. That capital went to South Korea and it went to Taiwan and it developed an industrial capacity that soon had South Korea and Taiwan with a lot of surplus capital which they did not know what to do with, so they took it elsewhere. There is a land grab going on in Africa. Who is grabbing the land? China is grabbing the land. There's a lot of complications here in which colonialism and anti-colonialism give a far too simple kind of structure. The company that was going to move into the special economic zone in West Bengal was Indonesia. And it was there that people were killed trying to defend their particular space against dispossession. The political economy of what I call accumulation by dispossession, which is going on worldwide, is organized by all kinds of different groups from all kinds of different places. So actually, capital in some ways is a moving target in terms of what it is and how it's evolving. And I think sometimes we put categories like imperialism, colonialism, which come from the 19th century, and try to put all of this dynamic into those categories. And I think that's seriously misleading. I think that actually right now I would not call China a decolonized space even, but it has huge impact across Southeast Asia and elsewhere. It has a huge impact in terms of its demand for raw materials. China has consumed about half of the world's iron ore, half of the world's copper over the last 10, 15 years. All of those countries which have been part of the China trade, Australia, Chile, have expanded very dramatically because they supply raw materials to China. But if you analyze what we would call extractivism, the practices of extractivism from different parts of the world for other parts of the world, then there are all sorts of patterns which you start to see. And so I think that it's very important that we should look very closely at the actual geographical dynamic of what capital is about, what spaces it exploits, what spaces does it create which then become dangerous for it. Remember, North America, United States, was a colony. It got decolonized very early. It became the center of capital accumulation worldwide 100 years or so later. And that seems to me to be is part of, again, what the historical dynamic of capitalism has been about. And within that, we see shifting hegemonies of the sort that Giovanni Arrighi wrote about in the long 20th century. So I would like to suggest that we work more closely with what is going on the ground. And then what we see is geopolitics emerging. I mean, what is the geopolitical ambition of Turkey right now? What is it trying to do in terms of its positionality in the global economy? What are its strategies? Why does it have to be so negative in relationship to what the Kurdish people want? What is that about? Is that something that's imposed by some faraway capitalist power, or has it everything to do with the strategic moves of Turkey over the last 50 years to try to reposition itself geopolitically and geoeconomically in a global economy that has been moving and changing very rapidly and very fast? So I would make a plea to look much more specifically at exactly how capital is moving, where it moves to, what it does when it arrives in some place, what kinds of labor and relations does it impose, what kinds of state apparatus does it insist upon creating, and how does it do it? So I would like to insist that if you want a realistic politics in terms of what you're trying to do here, that you not put it into these overly simplistic categories like imperialism or colonialism.
So, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. I feel really psyched about all of the weekend, having lived my last 3 years in one of the most neoliberal cities in Germany, Hamburg. It feels really nice to be in the middle of so many anti-capitalists. So, way to go. And I would like to ask a question to Professor Harvey. Great fan of your work, and in order to express this appreciation in a dialectical way, I would like to be critical of a few remarks you made. You were not very happy with nationalism in Scotland or certain struggles elevating themselves over anti-capitalist struggles when it comes, to, for example, to feminism or environmental struggles. In the 19th century, when communist struggles really started to gain ground, internationalism was the word of the day. And I believe that internationalism still presupposes various nationalism coexisting together. And I would like to hear whether you think that internationalism can be achieved without particular nationalisms. And on the other hand, regarding your calling Bookchin's remark on the anarchists and Marxists being the being of fundamental importance for the future of the left, do you think that the labor theory of value can still be a unifying theory for all anti-capitalist struggles? Thank you.
Right now? Asking right now. Okay.
Moment.
I would like to put a big question mark on the labor theory of value. I think not only has it been challenged, I think, seriously challenged by, intellectually, I think that circumstances have changed radically over the last 50 years to raise issues about what is in fact the theory of value which is operative within capitalism at this time. I'm interested in organizing a conference on that topic because I don't know the answer. I hope that people will consider seriously the issue, and because we need to elaborate upon that. I wasn't quite sure about the first part of your question. I think that one of the things that it's clear to me about the nature of capital is that one of the biggest dangers for capital is excessive centralization. So that there has been a long history of decentralization and centralization. What this suggests is that capital works best with a political system that is disaggregated and dispersed. And in fact, we've seen a great deal of emphasis within capitalism itself over the last 30 or 40 years on the virtues of decentralization. Now, the most decentralized system that exists under capitalism is, of course, the market. And the point about this is one of the best ways in which you can maintain and augment centralized power is through decentralization. It's a paradox, it seems, but it's a contradiction. But it's what Marx called a certain unity in this contradiction. And what that suggests is that capital is not at all antagonistic to a partitioning nationalism which actually favors a capitalist cosmopolitanism. And I think for this reason, you don't find huge battles fought by capital against nationalism, except over certain questions, such as tariffs. So as long as nationalism exists within the framework of the World Trade Organization, everything as far as capital is concerned is fine. Keep the markets open, fight each other over this or that everywhere, fine. You fight each other, not us, fine. So that there is, in my mind, a certain kind of political organization of the state system, if we want to call it that, which is advantageous for capital accumulation and for the unhindered continuation and expansion of capital accumulation. Now, again, I'm not arguing that this is all functional for capital, because clearly geopolitical rivalries emerge, wars erupt, which are not necessarily good things from the standpoint of capital accumulation, though capital will always find ways of taking advantage of them. So the whole relationship between territorial organization of power, which is the state system, backed in many instances by nationalist movements and the like, contrasts with what I call the molecular movement of capital, of money capital, through space and time on a continuous basis, which is also a form of power. So the two forms of power are constantly relating, adjusting, configuring together. And they sometimes run up against each other, and that can actually be the source of a considerable crisis for capital accumulation. When that happens, what we see is the power of the bondholders that says, in effect, if you're going to fight wars, you're going to have to borrow money. And if you borrow money from us. And I think that exacts a price. The first central bank in the world, the Bank of England, which came from 1694, arose because the state needed money to fight a war, turned to the merchants of London and said, lend us the money. And they said, we'll lend you the money, give us the Bank of England, which is going to control the money supply. And so, ever since then, the power of the central bankers has been what I would call the state finance nexus. Is the power of the central bankers plus the secretaries of the Treasury. And it was fantastic to see this on television in 2008 when Lehman Brothers went back. All the politicians disappeared. The president was nowhere to be seen. Who was there? Hank Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury. Ben Bernanke, head of the Federal Reserve. And they basically came on TV and said, here is what we're going to do. And here is how we're going to do it. And they came with 3 pages and said to Congress, here's a 3-page document, you sign it, and we're off. And Congress looked at it and it balked, and it basically said, we can't possibly sign a 3-page document. So Congress turned it into a 300-page document, which nobody could understand, but which said exactly the same things as the 3-page document. And that was the rescue of global capitalism. Literally. Because otherwise it would have crashed. So this is, I think, how the system tends to work.
Okay, I have 2 short questions. Hopefully we will hear short answers. First to David Harvey. You referred just to the central banks and to the state system of finance. earlier you said we live under the dictatorships of the central bankers, and later that some democracies are like constituted through money power and so on. And earlier you said the Paris Commune did one really bad thing for them. They protected the Bank of France, or the money reserves they had within the Bank of France. Why was this such a big mistake? And again, referring to the situation we have now, for example, in Europe, with the central bank, remembering that just 2 weeks ago there took place in Frankfurt big demonstrations against the politics of the central banks in Europe. What would be your suggestions or your demands to this regime of central banks for today? Reformistic ones, which could help us formulate some political demands too, or revolutionary ones to replace them, do whatever else, but not this shitty crisis politics that the ECB, for example, does. Second question, and I'm going to pose it in German because I heard it also in German, is to Rojda Yıldırım. Sie haben in dem Vortrag zwischendurch gesagt, also in den natürlichen Gesellschaften oder auch ursprünglichen Gesellschaften hatten Religionen sozusagen immer eine friedliche Rolle. Und erstmal frage ich mich, wie können eigentlich in Gesellschaften irgendwie, also wie können die eigentlich natürlich sein oder ursprünglich? Das geht ja gar nicht, wenn Menschen miteinander irgendwie Gesellschaften bilden, dann wo ist ja die Natur? Und viel wichtiger, wo liegen die konkreten Ansatzpunkte, dass irgendwie Religionen darin dann so friedlich sind grundsätzlich erstmal, weil so als Atheist kennt man ja immer nur so die bösen Schriften, aber irgendwelche anderen Ansatzpunkte wird es ja auch geben, die zu dieser These geführt haben. Danke.
I think one of the big issues, which is both a technical issue but also a symbolic issue, is the democratization of money creation. And this turns out to be a fantastic moment to consider this. We now have money exchange systems embedded in people's phones. You know, the mobile phone app, which you can actually use in the same way you can buy a SIM card for your phone, you can buy, in a sense, a small credit card inserted inside of your phone. It should be possible to use digital cyber currencies so that, in effect, people create their own money through their own activity. This would completely destroy the power of the central banks. In fact, some of the systems that now actually exist, like Bitcoin and so on, are kind of have all kinds of potentialities, but they're essentially pro-capitalistic in what they do. In fact, the right wing is very, very, very interested in cyber currencies and mobilizing them, because the right wing does not like central banks either. There's a very peculiar alliance between left and right about defunding the International Monetary Fund, about getting rid of the central banks and the power of the central banks. I think the left is very remiss about converting local currencies and so on, which have been experimented with but which have largely failed for certain technical and also social reasons. The left has not explored alternative monetary forms with the thoroughness that they deserve. I'm not myself very good at cyber stuff, You know, I still have to get people to help me figure out how my phone works. I'm of that generation, but my daughter is far better at it than I am. She teaches me how to run my phone. But clearly, there are opportunities right now. And I think that to the degree that money is, say, a representation of value, and somebody is in control of that representational form, it seems to me that the centralization of that control in the hands of the state is one of the ways in which the state maintains its power, because the state not only has a monopoly over the means of violence, it also has a monopoly over the currency, unless it submerges that authority within, as has happened with the euro, in an alternative monetary source. And I think not to control that democratically is one of the key mistakes that many organizations on the left have made. And it's something that therefore needs to be carefully looked at. And I would hope that this question would enter in upon the agenda in what is going on in Kobani and the like, and how activity in a confederation, that's what will be developed outside of the monetary calculus that exists within the central banks and within the monetary apparatus that currently basically rules the world, which is where US imperial power is still hegemonic, since the dollar is the reserve currency and the US has the power of seigniorage over that reserve currency. That has to be something that has to be taken away from the United States, and the only way to do that is by democratizing money issue so that we create our own currency through our own activity and then freely trade on that basis.
Şimdi sınıflı toplum öncesinde, yani sınıfların, egemenliğin, devletin ya da hiyerarşinin olmadığı doğal toplumlarda, örneğin animistik inançlarda doğaya saygı temelinde gelişir ve asla yıkıcılık temelinde bir mantalite yüklenmez. Totemde yine canlılara ve hayvanlara saygı temelinde gelişir. Yine biliyorsunuz birçok doğal toplumda ana tanrıçalık inancına inanmak vardır ve ana tanrıçanın bolluk, bereket, toprağın kutsanması, aslında bereketin, ürünün, canlılarla, ekosistemle kurulan dengenin kutsanması üzerine inanç kendini toplumsal bir karaktere büründürür. Bu açıdan doğal toplumlardaki inançlar hiçbiri başka bir inanç karşısında yıkıcı, çatıştırıcı ya da savaş nedeni olarak kendini kurgulamaz. Tam tersi pozitif değerler üzerinden. Yani pozitif değerler üzerinden kendi toplumsallığını oluşturur. Bu pozitif değerler üretim ve doğayla kurduğu ilişki üzerinden şekillenir. Bana göre doğal toplum nedir diye sordunuz. Yani doğal toplumun bir tarifi var mı? Evet. Sömürünün, sınıfların, egemenliğin, hiyerarşinin olmadığı bir toplum bana göre doğal bir toplumdur. Çünkü orada bir bozulma yoktur. Yani insan ve toplumdaki bozulmayı getiren aslında hiyerarşi, devlet, iktidar ve sömürü ve sınıflar sisteminin kendisidir. Bu açıdan sınıflı uygarlıkta bu koşullarda doğan bütün dinler devlete ve iktidara bulaştığı için bu çatıştırıcı savaş ve sömürü açısından da bir araç haline dönüşebilmiştir. O anlamda sınıflı uygarlık öncesindeki doğal toplum inançlarıyla sınıflı toplum uygarlıkta gelişen inançları da yani bu anlamda ayırarak değerlendirmekte fayda vardır. Mesela şu an günümüz açısından, güncel olan örnekler açısından, örneğin din ile yönetilen, işte İran'dan tutalım bugün Afganistan'a kadar, Türkiye'den tutalım Orta Doğu'daki birçok ülkeye kadar, gerçekten bunların gerçek anlamda dinle bir bağlantılarının olup olmadığını, tam tersine dinin özüne, toplumsal karakterine ihanet ederek bugün din adına Yemen'e girildiğini, din adına Afganistan'a girildi, din adına bugün Rojava'da bir savaşa girildiğini hepimiz biliyoruz. O açıdan dincilik tıpkı milliyetçilik gibi, cinsiyetçilik gibi ve bilimcilik gibi aslında tehlikeli bir ideolojidir. O anlamda ben dinciliğin bugün bir kapitalist modernitenin tetikçi bir ideolojisi olarak kullanıldığını söylemekte fayda var. Devlet iktidarın bulaşmadığı dinler kesinlikle çatıştırıcı ve savaştırıcı değildir. Teşekkür ederim.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we're out of time here. It's 5 o'clock. We'll have the second session begins in 1 hour from now. No, so
Eine Stunde
go get some
Pause.
food.
Eine Stunde Pause.